speaker comes to us from France. It's Professor Belusif, who is Professor of Anesthesiology and Critical Care Medicine at the Avicenne University Hospital in Bobigny, France. And he will speak to us concerning the relationship between the patient and the doctor and how we've moved perhaps from a paternalistic, patriarchal model of relationship from the doctor to the patient versus a shared decision-making model.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate your invitation from all the organizers, and especially from Ioannis. And it's really a thrill to be here because we have so many interesting lectures also on such very different topics. So this was really key. Initially, I was puzzled by the word. I was puzzled by the patriarch, Dr. Patriarch. So since I don't know what a patriarch is, I went to Google and I found, so it's a man who ruled a family, a clan, a tribe with a Bible, for also all the bishops of Rome, and the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and so on, even with the Mormon Church, a very old, venerable man and elder. Well, this is absolutely me. So I'm already a Dr. Patriarch. Why should I move to a shared decision making? I don't want to share power. And in fact, if I don't want to share power, so we have a clash between a battle of who owns the main political power. Is it the doctor on the left or is it the patient on the right? And then we have to understand, and I know that just because you're right, this doesn't mean I'm wrong. We haven't seen life from my side. So we need to try to understand how would be life from the other party, in fact. And so to try to understand this shift from the patriarch to the shared decision-making, I would like to propose briefly 3 revolutions that change those patients-physicians relationship. And you notice that the patient is singular and physician is a plural. And now we can imagine that for any care, if I go to appendicitis and go to appendectomy, the number of healthcare workers that would be surrounding the patients moved in the last 30 years from the number of 15 to 20 to now more than 80. It takes 80 healthcare workers to remove an appendix. It's unbelievable. We got the first emergency room nurse and the second ER nurse, and then the med student and the lab, and then you will go to radiology, do the echogram, maybe a CT scan, come back to the operating room. So it becomes a very complex system. And for any complex system, of course, the costs would be sky high, as we saw. And then we understand that we would need some coordination between all those healthcare workers. And this thing happens with a lot of revolutions. First, we have occurrence of new behaviors for patients. The second would be attention to ethics and empowerment of patients. And finally, a growing influence of national and public policies in medical and financial control of medicine, just as we have just seen. So what are those new behaviors for patients? Well, I believe that the 2 main factors from patients would be Google and TV. I work in a very poor neighborhood near Bobigny in the suburbs of Paris, and even my patients are very poor. I guess that maybe 50% of them went to Google to try to understand what their disease is. Now, if we move to very affluent, influent, and rich parts in Paris, maybe 100% of the patients went to Google to understand what is their disease, and then they put your name in PubMed or in Google to know how many publications you have on a given subject. So this induces a kind of consumer behavior, which I think is critically important. The second big influencer is TV. If you look at Dr. House, I have a colleague in my hospital who made a funny study to see that in Dr. House they have 1 examination every 3 minutes. 72% of the patients got MRI, they got 56% got biopsies, and so on. So, which means that with a very big number of citizens, patients watching the show, maybe they would be they will not get in the real hospital what they see on TV. But again, this tend to induce a very consumer-like attitude. The second revolution would be attention to ethics and empowerment, because we understand that old-fashioned medical paternalism is now over, but also full-blooded autonomy. And we will see that autonomy, seen as the sole ethical principle, can be very difficult. And in fact, we need to have new understandings of mature relations between patients and healthcare workers. And also, chronic diseases modify our approach to medicine, and this implies we must have some improvement in communication, attention to ethics and humanities. Now, with the Cancer Society, cancer is becoming a chronic disease. It is a chronic disease, so it is long-standing, just like diabetes or heart failure now. And so, what kind of role model? If we saw just one slide I presented in the first convention with the kind of historic steps in medicine, initially the physician was a sorcerer, he was very influent, illness was seen as a curse, and then we had religion-based hospitals because all we got was incantations, prayers, and hope. And so the doctor has no treatment, but he's a kind of intermediary between the gods and the humans. Seen with to see a poor child with angina, he has the big power to say, this is a diphtheria, he's going to die, or it's a simple angina, he will heal. So the doctor has no therapeutic power, and he has immense symbolic powers. But then, with the 20th century and the invention of modern medicine and so on, physician is now becoming a technician. There is a progressive reduction of the risks, social security. We have a tension between paternalism and autonomy, because this same physician going to see the patient, now if the child is not cured, this is because of the physician, because he didn't choose the correct, appropriate antibiotic to cure him. So now the physician has very great therapeutic powers, and he has zero symbolic power. And finally and lastly, physician is seen now as a consultant in risk management. With therapeutic alliance, health, HMOs, managed care, and so on, the physician is not only here for prevention, he's here for precautionary principle. For me, as an anesthesiologist, initially when I was in the OR, if something bad happened, this was because of bad luck. And I had a very old mentor who said that there is only two ways to die in the hospital, to die in the operating room. This is either because of massive hemorrhage, this is because of the surgeon, or this is because of myocardial infarction, this is because of the patient. You, as an anesthesiologist, it is always okay for you. But now this is no longer this kind of thing. And so initially it was because of bad luck, then I become a technician, I must be here if something wrong happens. But now I'm really a consultant in risk management, because one of my main jobs is, see, in the pre-op clinic to make everything so smooth that the complication will not occur. And you, as oncologist, you have exactly the same thing. The gynecologist of my wife is not here just in case she got breast cancer or uterine cancer. His main job is to make sure that the cancer does not appear, does not develop. So we see that we have a very change in the general understanding of care. Of course, something more in the future, after having been a sorcerer, a technician, or an engineer, now we as physicians, we need to be philosophers and humanists, because whatever the prudence, the prevention of the precaution that I can do, something bad will happen. So I need to learn to cope with emotions and communicate with the patient. Because we shifted, of course, from a pure paternalistic logic, the patriarch, to a contract-based logic with its successes, whereas we should already strive for humanism, philosophy, and spirituality. And my big bias would be that shared decision-making is no longer useful. This is the past. The future of our care will be a true therapeutic alliance between the physician and the patient that would be at the same level of understanding. This is from Medscape, and this is a question in French asked to French physicians who said, would you be ready to minimize the risks of a procedure or a treatment that you feel beneficial for the patient so you can get his consent? I mean, would you be ready to lie? In French, 40% of the French doctors say yes, compared to only 27% of European doctors and compared to only 10% of American doctors. But of course, you know that Americans, they don't know how to lie. Look, if we move a little bit further with the Medscape ethics report, seeing this about for American doctors, would you ever hide information about a terminal diagnosis to bolster patients' attitude? 76% of American doctors said no. I'm always completely truthful about diagnosis. Well, I think this is a lie, but this is another question. 21% said yes, I would soften the news and give hope even if there is little chance of survival. And only 3% says yes, unless a patient is going to die imminently, I don't usually tell patient how bad it is. So American doctors do not lie to patients. If you compare this survey with these same questions between US and Europe, this is the figures that you just saw. 76% of doctors will not lie, compared to only 45% of doctors in Europe. 21% of doctors in USA would say, I would soften the news and give hope even if there is little chance of survival. This is almost half of the doctors in Europe. So we see that there is a lot of cultural influence on the way we practice medicine. And when in France I see Dr. House or Google or ER or whatever, and they behave in a certain way and ethical point of view, sometimes we would not have done this on the same way in our hospitals. Okay, so doctors do not lie. So what do the patients want? At 70% of the patient, I prefer having my healthcare professional explain things and let me come to my own decision after I review my options. This is me, myself, I. They want to decide. They are not children anymore. There is only 10% that will say, I prefer having my healthcare professional direct my health decisions. And 20%, I prefer researching and coming up with my own option and then making decisions with my healthcare professional. They want to decide. They want to be in charge. And this has something to do with the cardinal ethical principles. And when you look at all English-speaking textbooks from UK or USA, the cardinal ethical principle would be first autonomy, you must respect the patient and so on, then beneficence, then non-maleficence, and finally distributive justice to ensure that given the amount of money you got in the hospital, you try to cure everyone. A nice and interesting difference, I think, is when you compare English-speaking textbooks and French-speaking textbooks. In French, the same cardinal ethical principles are presented with beneficence first, and then non-maleficence, then autonomy, and finally distributive justice. So you remember that when we say primum not nocere, first do not harm. In fact, for a French doctor, primum non nocere is secundum non nocere, because the very first thing you have to do is have some beneficence and be keen to the patient. But we see that this difference between on both sides of the Atlantic is not only symbolic, because on this end, the doctor is in fact the son of the king. He decides. Compared to the USA, with maybe more of a Protestant attitude, there is more value for autonomy on these things. So what should we teach for our students? What would be the future? Maybe we need to have an obligation to respect the common good and have some kind of balance, a kind of equilibrium. Because of course there is autonomy and the due respect to the other. Because autonomy without beneficence is not really fair. It is an abandonment. You abandon the patient. Because also on the other side, beneficence disrespectful to autonomy is also unfair. This can become dictatorship. So we need to have those two things. And maybe in the literature, because the pendulum swing on way on the other side, there are some interesting publications that shows that show the limits of autonomy or the limits for autonomy. And nice thing about published in the Journal of Medical Ethics about the concept of effective autonomy in healthcare. They take patients and they divide them in two groups. Group A needs to have a choice between surgery and radiation therapy with the results presented in survival framing. And Group B have the same choice to make with the results proposed in mortality framing. So let's suppose on this part you are Group A. Things would be presented this way. You got bad luck, you got lung cancer. If you go to surgery, out of 100% having surgery, 90 live throughout the post-op period, 68 are alive after 1 year, 34 are alive after 5 years. Now, if you go with radiation therapy, of 100% having radiation therapy all lived through the treatment, 77 are alive after 1 year compared to 68, and 22 are alive at the end of 5 years compared to this. Did you make your choice? Okay. Now shut your ears and let's assume that you are Group B. And I would say out of 100% having surgery, 10 die during surgery. This is the equivalent of the 90 guys here. 32 die by the end of the first year. This is the complementary of 68. And 66 die by the end of 5 years. Now, if you go to radiation therapy, none die during treatment, 23 die by the end of the 1 year, and 78 die by the end of 5 years. Okay, did you make your choice? Good. According to the principle of invariance in rational choice, the rationality of your choice is not affected by the framing of the information, right? When they look at the guys from Group A, that was all things presented in survival framing, 18% of the patient favor radiotherapy. When they presented to the Group B that choose with mortality framing, 44% favored radiotherapy, almost the double, more than the double. So there are two nice corollary about this. When you look at all the consent forms before a surgery, all the consents are always framed in the kind of survival format and never in the kind of mortality framing. And this makes sense. Let's suppose I'm this guy. Okay, 100%, 90 live throughout the post-op. Of course, if I decide to get surgery, this is because I want to live. So I am in those 90 guys. 68 are alive at the end of the first year. First year, 1 year, 1 year. This is tomorrow. Tomorrow, there is no way I'm going to die. So I'm still running in this show. So after 5 years, 34 here, 22 there. Okay, I get the surgery. So it's a kind of logical way of thinking and optimism that we have. Unless we are repeatedly taught about death. 100% having surgery, 10 die during surgery, 32 die at the end of the first year, then die at this one. So is it manipulation? Is this black magic? Is this white magic? This is manipulation, and the doctor must be aware of that. So now, maybe we need to be aware of the way patients can listen to how doctor frame message. Because it is very different to say, if you get this procedure, well, you know, it's a very safe procedure because 90% of the patients are still alive after this procedure, after 5 years. So this is good. You know, it might be a risky procedure because 10% of the patients die during this procedure. This is exactly the same thing. So maybe we need to be the more honest that we can and maybe frame the things between life and death, survival and mortality. So we need to be more aware of our communication and coordination skills just to be at the service of our patients. And I would propose you to see these 4 models of the physician-patient relationship, and this was published in the Journal of American Medical Association by Ezekiel Emanuel. Ezekiel Emanuel is a genius. He's an oncologist, and he's the guy who framed the Obamacare in the US, and he's also who wrote it. And he's also the guy who said that any patient in the US should be allowed to have some palliative or supportive care when he got cancer. This is Ezekiel Emanuel. This is him. Of course, his brother, he's the brother of Rahm Emanuel, the former House Chief of Staff of Barack Obama and now the actual mayor of Chicago. Yeah. But those two Obama brothers, they are failures, you know. The real brain, this is this is Ari Emanuel, and Ari Emanuel is one of the most influential agent of all the movie stars in Hollywood. Impossible to have the same family with three different careers at top level in very different areas in life. And so Ezekiel Emmanuel said that we progressively change from different models for those patient-physician relationships. And I forgot the S with physicians. The first one is the paternalistic model for the 19th century. I'm taking you to the OR, I have decided. And then until the First World War, informative model, you need surgery. I saw 2 years ago one doctor, he was a former doctor becoming a patient, and we were discussing about the evolution of a relationship between physicians and the patients, and he told me in 1950, he was a medical student in one of the big Parisian hospitals, and he saw the chief of surgery slapping a patient because he refused to get surgery. Those were the times. Nice time, right? Informative model, you need surgery. This is not beneficence, this is not paternalism, this is dictatorship. And then after World War II and the horrors of Nuremberg trial and the Nazi regime and so on, we moved to interpretative model. You need surgery, what are your preferences? You saw that we moved from beneficence to autonomy. And Ezekiel Emmanuel said that we Americans, we are stuck here. We need to go to a fourth path, which would be the deliberative model. You need surgery, beneficence, what are your preferences, autonomy, and if you are willing, I can tell you what would be mine. This is really sharing decision that can be a peer, that can be present, and this is kind of adult mature relationships. Because when we look at medical indications, say, let's suppose I got prostate cancer, the doctor would say, well, you can go with surgery, you got 80% 5-year survival, and you got 80% impotence. This is not good figures, but just to illustrate. But you can also go to radiation therapy, and you go with, you have 50% survival after 5 years, but you have only 30% impotence. It is not up for the doctor to decide, because he has no way to realize what is my sex life compared to my life in general. So the doctors know the medical indication and the impact on quality of life, and he must guess patient preferences and go to what the contextual features would be. Whereas the patient also has a job to do. He has to understand medical education, understand the impact on his or her quality of life. So this is really mutual understanding. And in the ICU, this is something that we have. When we meet with the next of kin and the family, we assess prognosis and degree of certainty, assess family preference for role in decision making. And then I will adapt a strategy according to what the patient or the family wants. Because if they want no role in decision making, I would be a paternalistic, old-fashioned physician and I will decide everything. If they want to be really in great control, then this is autonomy and the family decides. And sometimes in the mix, it can be a shared decision making. I think that we as physicians, we must be at the service of our patient. Because of course we have evidence-based medicine and so on, but maybe this changed now. Initially, evidence-based medicine was about asking focused questions, finding the evidence, performing critical appraisal, and then making a decision. You go to surgery, you go to radiation therapy, and then evaluate the performance of the treatment that has been performed. Maybe now patients want something else. They want to move from evidence-based medicine to preference-based medicine, a kind of super autonomy. This implies proper setup and introduction, eliciting values and preferences for the patients, understanding their goals, learning about their goals, what would be. Then go to debiasing strategies, responding to emotions, Making a recommendation, this is very different than making a decision. Making a recommendation, seeking a consensus, and then follow up the patient. I think that when I'll be a patient, this is the way I want to be cured. And finally, and quickly, the third step that shows that we have to those big difference is the growing influence of the state, national and public policies in medical and financial control of medicine. You remember Obamacare, healthcare is a human right, whatever the cost. We just saw the very important impact of the economic crisis on the care of any patients in the hospitals. And also, I think that this implies a kind of consumer-like attitude from the patients, because if they pay, they want to be the king of the show. And there is a very interesting landmark case in the United Kingdom, because a ruling by the UK court last year now forces doctors to tell their patients the full range of treatment options and allowing them to choose. And also, they say that there might be some problems if the process used to obtain consent is not appropriate. Because traditionally, it was up to doctors to decide what risks to communicate to the patient. But the British Supreme Court held that doctors must ensure patients are aware of any and all risks that an individual patient, not a doctor, might consider significant. In other words, doctors can no longer be the sole arbiter of determining what risks are material to the patient. And with the pendulum shifting from what the reasonable doctor would propose compared to what the reasonable patient would accept, I think we have a very high things to be very cautious about all those things. And so finally, my conclusion would be, of course, the old-fashioned patriarch doctor is over, he's dead, because we don't want to live in tyranny. But this was cure. But maybe now with the emergence of autonomy and care in addition to cure is essential, and this would be the basis of shared decision making. But maybe what the patient wants is not, they want more than that. They want coordination. They want that their emotions would be taken care of. They want a proper coordination between their healthcare professionals. So I think that shared decision making, alas, is already over. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Belousif. I think in the interest of time, we have to move on. You will excuse us, and we will leave discussions for later.